Hey everybody, welcome back to Park Ranger Files. All Appalachian today, people from all up and down the range sent these in, and some of them have been sitting in my inbox for a while because I wanted to get this video right. These are real submissions from real people, and I'm just gonna read them. Let's go. Story 1. I've been a Forest Service employee for going on 19 years now. Started when I was 22 and spent the bulk of that time working in the Western Carolina districts. Before I say anything else, I want to be clear that this is not a story I tell at work. I don't bring it up at the ranger station. I don't talk about it with other employees. I don't want it attached to my professional identity, because that's not the kind of thing that helps anyone's career in the federal land management system. The reason I'm sending it here is that I've heard a handful of other people over the years describe similar things in similar terrain, and it seems like it belongs somewhere in the record rather than just sitting in my head. This happened 7 years ago, late summer, in the Pisgah National Forest, in a more remote section. My job that particular week was trail condition assessment on a section that had been formally closed after significant storm damage the previous winter. The assignment was simple: walk the trail in segments, document what I found, flag areas that needed repair crews. Solo work, which I prefer. I cover more ground alone, and I don't have to calibrate my pace to another person or make conversation when I'd rather be paying attention to what's around me. The third day of that assignment, I was in a section that climbs through some genuine old-growth timber before the trail crosses a ridge and drops into a creek drainage on the far side. These are big trees, some of them 200 years old or more, the kind of forest that has a different quality of air and silence than younger second-growth stands. The light is different in old growth. The canopy is so high and full that the forest floor stays dim even at midday, and there's a specific density to the atmosphere that I notice every time I'm in it. I've worked in old growth sections many times over 19 years, and I'm comfortable in them, but I'm also alert in them because they deserve that. I was maybe 2 miles into the closed section when I found a campfire site just off the trail on a flat area of ground. Recent fire, not old. In the humidity of those mountains, ash goes from powdery and gray to dark, and compacted within a few days depending on rain. And what I was looking at was gray, fine, loose, meaning someone had built this fire within the past several days, not weeks. The ring was competently made, stones arranged properly. Whoever built it knew what they were doing. Trespassers in closed trail sections happen. I documented it and was going to move on. But before I moved on, I looked at what was arranged around the fire ring and stopped. On the stones themselves, spaced evenly around the full circle, were small bundles. 12 of them. I counted them twice. Each bundle was constructed from plant material, and I looked at all of them carefully, because I am someone who notices plants in this work, and each one used a different combination of species, but every species was native to that specific elevation range, in that specific part of the forest. Somebody hadn't grabbed random stuff from the forest floor. They'd collected specific things. Each bundle was tied with what looked like hand-twisted natural fiber cord, not twine from a hardware store. And the arrangement was perfectly even around the circumference of the ring. Not close to even. Perfectly even. I don't know what that was. I want to be honest about that rather than pretend I can identify it or categorize it from my 19 years of Forest Service work. What I can tell you is that it was not casual. The time and intention that went into that arrangement was significant. I photographed everything thoroughly and wrote up a detailed incident report and continued up the trail. About half a mile past the fire site, something was following me. I say something because I want to be accurate rather than dramatic. What I experienced was a persistent full-body awareness that something was behind me on the trail, maintaining a consistent distance. I've had bears follow me out of curiosity, and that is a different quality of awareness than what I'm describing. A bear following you produces specific sounds, breathing, footfalls in leaf litter, branches. What I was experiencing on the trail that day was none of those things. It was the sensation of being tracked without the audio evidence that should accompany it. I stopped and turned around 4 times. Each time, the trail behind me was empty as far as I could see. Each time, there was no sound of something moving away. When I stopped, no rustle, no snap, nothing. A following animal produces sound when the following stops because they have to do something with their momentum. This produced nothing. I stopped and turned, and the trail was quiet and empty, and then I kept walking, and the feeling continued. The 4th time I stopped, I said out loud into the forest that I was a federal employee. I was armed with a radio, and if anyone was back there on this closed trail, I needed them to identify themselves. I said it at full speaking volume, and then I waited 2 full minutes in silence. Nothing. No response, no sound of movement, no change. I finished the survey segment and returned to my vehicle and drove out. I filed the report on the fire site in the bundles. I did not include the following sensation in my official documentation because there is no field in the report form for that. And because, as I said at the start, I don't bring this to my professional life. I've been back to that section of trail many times since. It's part of my regular district now. Nothing unusual has happened on any subsequent visit. But every time I pass that flat area below the ridge, I look at the spot where the fire was, and I think about the quiet behind me on the trail, and I don't go back through there after 4 in the afternoon. Story 2. So Williamson sits right on the border with Kentucky, and it's where I was born and where I came back to at 35, when my mother's health started requiring more support than phone calls and visits could provide. I'd been in Columbus for 13 years working in accounting, and I thought I understood what coming back to the mountains would feel like, and I was wrong about most of it. Not wrong in a bad way necessarily. Just wrong in the way you're wrong when you've been away from a place long enough that you've replaced the real thing with a version you've constructed from memory. The mountains in that county are not the pretty postcard Appalachians. They are steep and dense, and the hollows between them are narrow enough that the light doesn't reach the floor until late morning and gives it up before the afternoon is done. There's a specific kind of quiet in those hollows that took me a while to reacclimate to after 13 years of city ambient noise. It's not a peaceful quiet, it's a heavy quiet. The difference matters. About 2 years into being back, so I would have been 37, I started getting in the habit of evening drives on the roads above town. My mother goes to bed early, and I'm a night person, and there was a restlessness that the drive helped with. There's a road that follows a ridge above Williamson, climbs up through the trees, and at the top there's a view west into Kentucky that on clear evenings is one of the better things you can see in that part of the state. I went up there probably 20 or 30 times over that period. One Tuesday evening in September, I was up there parked at a pull-off near the top, window down, watching the light change on the western hills. Good evening, temperature right, no particular thoughts in my head. I'd been there maybe 20 minutes. A truck came up the road and pulled into the pull-off and parked beside me. I noted it and went back to looking at the view. The driver got out and stood at the front of his truck and looked west the same as me. older man, probably mid-60s, dressed like someone who did physical work, not trying to impress anyone. He glanced over and I nodded and he nodded, and we existed in the same space without making it a thing, the way people do in places like this when they share a viewpoint on a mountain road. After a few minutes, he said, not really turning toward me, that I'd been away from here for a while. Not asked as a question. Said as a fact. I said yes, about 13 years. Came back from my mother. He said that was usually how it went, that the mountains hold on to people whether people want them to or not. We talked some after that. Easy conversation about the county, about changes since I'd left, about his own family's connection to the area going back a long way. He said his people had been in that county longer than the county records went. Wasn't bragging, just stating a fact of time. Then he asked, still looking out at Kentucky, if I'd ever noticed anything strange on this road at night. Casual question, like asking about road conditions. I said I'd heard stories from growing up. He nodded once. Said when he was young, his grandfather had told him about this ridge specifically, that people who'd been here before European settlement had known about it, that there was something in the rock formation of this particular ridgeline that ran differently from the ground on either side of it. He said his grandfather was not a man who talked about things he didn't mean. I asked what he meant by differently. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet where someone is finding the right words rather than deciding whether to speak. Then he said some places in these mountains, the distance between what's here and what's almost here gets thin. He said this ridge was one of those places. He said it wasn't dangerous and it wasn't bad, just different. And knowing that it was different was better than not knowing, because when you know you're paying the right kind of attention. He said he needed to get home before it got fully dark and got in his truck and drove back down. I sat there for a while after he was gone. The view was unchanged. The September light was doing the slow September thing it does when it finally lets go of the day. Everything around me was ordinary and calm. But I thought about what he'd said. Some places the distance between what's here and what's almost here gets thin. And I thought about all the times growing up when this road had a different quality than other roads. I'd always put that down to elevation, to the view, to being a kid with an active imagination. Sitting up there that evening alone after that conversation, I was less sure about all of those explanations. I've been up there many times since. The view is still the best view in that county going west. Some evenings feel exactly like an evening. Some evenings feel like something else is also there, attending to the same thing you're attending to from a position you can't quite locate. I go anyway. I figure knowing is better than not knowing. Story 3. The county I'm writing about has a smaller population than almost any county in the eastern United States. Under 2,000 people total, spread across terrain that has been discouraging settlement for about as long as anyone has been trying. National forest on 3 sides, farming in the valleys, the kind of isolation that is a choice for the people who stay there, and not an accident. I moved there when I was 31 from Washington, D.C., after a decade of city living that I found ultimately unsatisfying in ways I couldn't articulate until I stopped doing it. I bought 11 acres and a small house and started learning what I should have known for decades about actually living on land. The property borders national forests on the north and east sides. The back boundary runs along a ridgeline that marks the transition from my land to the forest. And I walk that fence line regularly, partly for maintenance, and partly because the ridgeline has the best views on the property, and I like to be up there. I know every section of that fence. I know which posts need watching and where the wire has been pushed by deer passing through and where the oak that fell 3 winters ago finally finished rotting into the ground. In my 3rd year there, late November, I found something on the ridgeline that I had not found before. A cairn. Stacked stones on the flat, rocky section near my northeast corner post. Maybe 18 inches high, carefully constructed. Not a hiker's casual pile of rocks, but a genuinely deliberate structure. The stones selected for fit, and the whole thing balanced and upright. I looked at it for a while, trying to remember if I'd seen it before, and knowing I hadn't, because I walked that section regularly, and I would have noticed something new. The issue wasn't just that there was a cairn. The issue was where it was. To reach that spot, you would have to either come through the national forest and cross my fence, or come through my property from the road end. And either way, you would have to know where you were going. That section of ridgeline isn't visible from any trail, and it's not a natural destination for someone wandering around. Someone had gone specifically there. I looked around the immediate area and found nothing else. No campfire, no trash, no tracks that were clear enough to tell me anything. I documented it in the notes I keep on the property and kept walking. 2 weeks later, there was a second cairn. Same ridgeline, roughly 30 feet east of the first, same construction quality. Then, 2 weeks after that, a third one. Further east again, still on the ridgeline, still inside my fence line. I started doing the fence walk more often. I never encountered anyone. The cairns appeared on their own schedule with no pattern I could identify. Some weeks nothing, some weeks a new one. I set up a basic trail camera near the corner post, pointed up the ridgeline. It captured deer, a bear once, a coyote twice, birds, and many nights of empty ridgeline. It never captured a person. I went to the county sheriff's office and described the situation: repeated trespassing, structures being built on my property. The deputy was polite and took a report and said there wasn't much he could do without a description of a person or a vehicle. He asked if anything had been damaged, and I said no. He asked if I felt threatened, and I said no, just that I wanted to know who was on my land and why. He said he'd note it and to call if anything changed. Nothing changed in the sense that the trespassing stopped. It just became its own ongoing feature of the property. I eventually stopped taking the cairns down. The first time I took one down, a new one appeared 2 feet from the spot where it had been, which felt like a kind of answer. The second time I took one down, the same thing happened. The third time I took one down, I thought about it for a while, standing on the ridgeline, and decided that dismantling these things wasn't going to resolve anything, and might be making things worse in a way I didn't understand. There are 9 of them now along that ridgeline. They've been stable for about 2 years, no new ones. None of the existing ones disturbed or moved. When I walk the fence, I walk past all of them. I know each one by its position, and I'd notice immediately if any of them changed. They don't change. They just sit on the ridge in the specific places they were put, and whatever they mark, they're marking it consistently. My neighbor 2 properties over, a man whose family has farmed that valley since before it was mapped by the federal government, asked me once about the cairns when we were talking at the road. He asked how many there were, and I told him 9. He nodded slowly and said that was about right. I asked about what, and he said about what he'd expect for that particular ridgeline. I asked what was particular about it. He changed the subject with the smooth efficiency of a person who's done it before, and I let him. I've asked him about it since. He changes the subject every time. I've decided to respect that boundary and just tend the fence and let the Karens be. Story 4. 16 years of large animal veterinary practice in the North Carolina mountains. I want to be upfront about what I do for a living because it matters to how I process this. My job requires me to be accurate. When I say something is wrong with an animal, I have to be right or the animal suffers. I don't speculate. I don't embellish. I describe what I observe and I draw conclusions from evidence. That habit of mine is with me all the time, not just at work. I do farm calls all over a 3-county area. A lot of driving on backroads, a lot of early mornings and late nights. You get to know the roads when you drive them in every season and every kind of weather for that many years. You notice when something is off. This was a January night, close to midnight. I'd just finished a difficult calving on a farm out in the valley, and I was driving back on one of the ridge roads I'd probably taken 1,000 times before. Cold and clear, no cloud cover, the kind of January night in the mountains where the stars are overwhelming. If you're out in the open and the tree canopy closes everything off when you're in the forest. About 4 miles from the main road, I came around a curve and my headlights hit something standing in the road. I've hit deer. I've nearly hit bears twice. I've seen foxes, coyotes, wild turkeys, raccoons, every kind of animal that crosses mountain roads at night. I know what the shapes look like when headlights find them, and I know the way animals respond to headlights. The freeze, the eye shine, the posture of an animal that's about to bolt. What was in the road did not have eye shine. It was standing upright in a way that immediately read as wrong for any animal I know. Too tall and too configured in a specific way I'm struggling to describe without sounding like I'm reaching for something dramatic. It was not a person. I have also seen people on mountain roads at night, hunters and hikers and people whose cars broke down. And the shape in the road was not a person. It was approximately person height or somewhat above it, standing in the center of the road. And it did not react to my headlights with any of the responses I know from either animals or people. I slowed to a stop about 30 feet from it. My lights were on at full. It turned and went into the trees on the right side of the road. Not quickly, deliberately. The way it moved going into the trees was not the way that anything I've treated or observed in 16 years moves. I sat in my truck for probably 3 minutes after it was gone. Then I drove home. I've told 2 people this story in the years since. My husband, who believed me without making it into something bigger than I'd described, and a friend who is also a large animal vet, who said she'd heard a similar account from a farmer on the other side of the range and left it at that. I'm writing it here because it happened, and because I'm a person who believes that accurate records of observation have value, regardless of whether the observation fits into an existing category. Story 5. I'm a retired school teacher, 31 years in the same district. And I want to say first that I have been skeptical of ghost stories and unexplained things my entire adult life. I grew up hearing stories in these mountains that I always chalked up to superstition or isolation or just the way fear becomes narrative over enough generations. I still think that about a lot of things I was told growing up. I'm not writing in to tell you I've changed my whole worldview. I'm writing because one thing happened that I cannot put into my old framework. And I think the honest thing is to acknowledge that, rather than force it to fit somewhere it doesn't fit. My husband and I have a cabin on a piece of land that has been in his family for 4 generations. We go up there in the summers and on some weekends in fall. The cabin is simple. No television. We read and hike, and the grandchildren come when they want to. 2 summers ago, end of July, I woke up at a little past 3 in the morning for no reason. That happens sometimes as you get older, and I usually just lie there until I go back to sleep. I was lying there, looking at the ceiling, when I heard singing outside. A woman's voice. Clear and full and not quiet, not the kind of thing you'd mistake for wind or a dream. A real voice, singing. The melody was not a melody I recognized. Not a hymn, not a folk song, anything like what I knew. Just a melody that was doing something I can't describe, except to say it had more shape than songs usually have, like it kept turning back on itself in a way that shouldn't have resolved, but kept resolving. I lay there for a while before I woke my husband, trying to determine if I was still partly asleep. I was not. I woke him and he heard it too, and his face when he heard it was not the face of a man who was going to tell me I was imagining things. We both lay there listening to it for what I believe was close to 4 minutes before it stopped. When it stopped, it did not trail off or fade. It stopped completely, like a recording ending. I looked out every window in the cabin. There was no one in the clearing, no one on the path in from the road. The full moon was up and the clearing was entirely visible and empty. I asked my husband's mother about it the next time we saw her. She is in her mid-80s, and her memory is still sharp. I described what we heard as carefully as I could. She went quiet, and then she said her own mother had told her about a woman who sang on that ridge. I asked when. She said she didn't know. She said she thought it had been happening longer than the family had been there. I don't know what to do with that. I'm 64 years old, and I've spent a career teaching children to think critically. I heard a woman singing outside my cabin at 3 in the morning, and there was no woman there. Those two facts don't resolve. I've stopped trying to make them. Hey, before we keep going, if something happened to you out in these mountains or anywhere else, the submission link is in the description. We read every single one that comes in. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please just do that. Now, it keeps this channel alive and it costs you nothing. All right, back to the stories. Story 6. I do search and rescue as a volunteer, going on 11 years with the county team. I'm not going to be specific about which county or state because there are people on my team who know my name and I don't want this coming back to me professionally, but it's in the southern Appalachians, and that's close enough. We pulled a man out of a backcountry drainage one October who had been missing for 3 days. He was dehydrated and in rough shape, but not critical. When we found him, he was sitting on a boulder above a creek, not injured, not sick in any way that was immediately apparent, just sitting there. He'd been an experienced backpacker, knew the area, had all his gear. We could not figure out why he hadn't moved. In the vehicle on the way out, after we'd gotten fluids into him and he'd warmed up some, I asked him what had happened. He was quiet for a while. Then he said that at some point on the second day, he'd walked into a section of the forest that felt different and he hadn't been able to make himself walk out of it. I asked, different how? He thought about it and said that inside that section, which he described as a rough triangle of maybe 2 or 3 acres, with no obvious physical boundary he could identify, time felt wrong. Not that he couldn't tell time passed, he had a watch, but that the time passing felt like it wasn't connected to anything outside of that small space. Like time was happening, but only locally. He said he tried walking out of the section multiple times, and each time he found himself back at the boulder without understanding how. He was a software engineer from Atlanta. He wasn't prone to this kind of description, he said, and he was embarrassed by it. But that was what had happened. I've been on that ridge since on other calls, and I know the drainage he was describing. There is nothing physically unusual about it that I can identify. It's just forest. But I've talked to two other members of my team quietly and individually over the years, and both of them independently use the word strange about the same drainage, without me mentioning his story first. Story 7. My grandmother raised me after my parents split up and I was 7, and she lived all her life in the same hollow in eastern Kentucky where she was born. When I was growing up with her, she talked about the old things the same way she talked about weather or crops, not as supernatural, just as information about the place you lived that you needed in order to live there, right? She called certain spots on the mountain haints ground. Not dramatically. The way you'd say the third step is loose or the creek floods in March. Just information. Stay off haints ground after dark. Don't cut wood from the trees that grow on it. If you're up there and you smell something sweet for no reason, come home. I didn't think much about it as a kid, except to follow what she said, because that's what you did. I went to college, moved to Cincinnati, became a mechanical engineer, built a life. The framework I built that life on didn't have room for what my grandmother described, and I was comfortable with that. She passed when I was 38, and I went back to settle her property. The house and the hollow are still in my name. I go back a couple times a year. Last fall, I was up on the hillside above the house, doing some work on an old fence line mid-afternoon. Clear day, temperature fine, nothing unusual. And I smelled something sweet. Not flowers, not something I could identify as a plant. Just a sweetness in the air that came from nowhere and had no source I could locate. I stood there for a minute, identifying what I smelled and making sure I was right about the sweetness being real and being sourceless. Then I went home. I didn't feel afraid. I felt like I should follow the information I'd been given by someone who'd known this place her whole life. I went home and I've been back since, and nothing unusual has happened on any visit since then. But I stood in that field and smelled what she told me I'd smell if I was on haints ground. And I followed what she told me to do, and I'm glad I know the difference between stubbornness and wisdom. Story 8. I run a small outfitter in western North Carolina, guided day hikes and overnight trips into the backcountry. I've been taking groups out there for 14 years. I've seen people do strange things in the woods, get scared for no reason they can name, become convinced someone is watching them on trails that see maybe 20 people a year. I usually write it off as sensory overload. People who live in cities with constant stimulation go into genuine quiet, and their brains don't know what to do with the absence. They fill the quiet with threat. It's a normal response, I'm telling you that. So you understand that my default interpretation when people get spooked in the backcountry is ordinary psychology and not anything else. I had a group of 4 adults 2 summers ago. A married couple and 2 friends of theirs, all experienced hikers from the Northeast. Good group. No drama, good fitness. They knew what they were doing. We were on the second day of a 3-day loop, camped at a site I've used probably 60 times, and the husband woke me at around 2 in the morning. He was calm but serious and said I needed to come look at something at the tree line. I came out of my tent and all 4 of them were standing at the edge of camp looking into the trees. At the tree line in the dark, I had my headlamp. They had theirs. There were lights, small, unfixed, moving slowly through the trees at a height of about 4 to 6 feet off the ground. Not fireflies. October. Not reflections of our headlamps. The movement was too purposeful and too even for that. Not flashlights, no beam, just points of light, a pale yellowish white. I counted 7 or 8 of them at various times. They were spaced irregularly and moving independently, but staying generally within a 20-foot section of tree line. We watched them for close to 15 minutes. They didn't approach, they didn't retreat. They just moved, slow and even, like they were doing something specific in that 20-foot stretch of forest. Then they were gone. Not all at once, they faded out over maybe 2 minutes, one by one, until the tree line was dark. Nobody in that group had a theory. I didn't either. I've camped at that site many times before and many times since, and I have never seen that again. I looked up swamp gas and foxfire and bioluminescent fungi, and none of those explanations fit what I observed that night. I'm filing it under observed, unexplained, and I've been doing this long enough that I'm at peace with that category. Story 9. I'm a wildlife biologist. I've been doing fieldwork in the southern Appalachians for going on 12 years, primarily focused on salamander populations, which means I spend a lot of time in creek drainages and seep habitats, often alone, often in wet terrain twine that most people don't access. I say this so you understand I'm comfortable in remote backcountry in a way that comes from 12 years of actually being in it, not from thinking I would be comfortable in it. The thing I want to report is not dramatic. I want to be clear about that because I'm wary of dramatic framing. What happened was this. For 3 consecutive trips to the same drainage over the course of one summer, every time I was working in a particular quarter-mile section, the salamanders were gone. That section of creek had one of the highest population densities I'd documented in that drainage. I'd been surveying it for years. In that one summer on those 3 visits, every quadrant in that section came back at 0. No salamanders in the surface cover, no larvae in the water, nothing. The sections upstream and downstream were normal. Just that quarter mile, empty. On the 3rd visit, I sat at the edge of the section for a while before I started my survey, trying to figure out what I was picking up from the environment before I had numbers. The drainage was normal in terms of water quality, turbidity, temperature. The vegetation was intact. There was no sign of a chemical spill or a landslide or any other event that would explain a local population collapse. What I noticed, and I want to be very precise here, because I know how this sounds, was that the quarter-mile section felt observationally different. Not frightening, not threatening. Just as though the quality of attention in that space was not the same as the quality of attention on either side of it. I'm a scientist, and I know that's not a useful description. I'm including it anyway because it was what I observed with the only instrument I had available for that particular measurement. By autumn, the salamander populations were back at normal densities in that section. Whatever the cause, whatever had produced the absence, it resolved. I published the data with no speculative interpretation. I've noted the observation here because the submission form asked for what happened, and that was what happened. Story 10. My family has been in this one valley in Tennessee for 5 generations. And I say that not to establish any kind of credibility about the mountains, but to explain why when I say something is different up there than anywhere else I've ever been, I'm saying it from the position of someone who has spent his whole life there and has something to compare it against. I left for 8 years to serve in the military and came back at 26. The transition back was harder than I expected. Not emotionally, the mountains felt right, but the quality of attention the place required was different from what my training had built into me. The military trains you to keep your eyes moving, maintain your situational awareness in a constant outward sweep. The mountains wanted me to pay attention differently, inward and downward and quieter. Not the scanning kind of attention, but the staying still kind. My grandfather told me when I got back that the valley was glad to have me home. I thought that was a sentimental thing to say. He said, no, I mean that literally. This valley pays attention to who's in it. I've thought about that a lot since. The incident I want to document happened about 3 years after I got back. I was deer hunting in a section of the family land I'd hunted since I was a kid. Dawn, late November, I'd been in the same stand I always used. Nothing unusual at any part of the morning. At some point around 7:30, I heard something that I'm still not able to describe accurately. It wasn't a sound exactly. It was more like the space around the sound. A sound makes the way you can hear a bell ring, and then the silence where the bell was still ringing is different from the silence before it rang. There was a moment where the forest made that shape, that particular silence that is the shape of something that was just there. Nothing was there when I looked. The deer I'd been watching in the edge of the field bolted before I raised my rifle, all of them at once and all in the same direction, which deer don't do unless something frightened them all simultaneously from a single source. I never identified the source. My grandfather said that night, when I told him that the valley was just showing me, it remembered me. I didn't know what to do with that then. I'm not sure I know what to do with it now. But I have not had a morning in that stand since where I didn't feel at some point like something was paying attention back. Quick break, thank you to everyone who's been sending stories in. The volume lately has been incredible, and we're getting to all of them. If you want to support what we're doing here, the easiest way is to hit the like button right now. It takes 1 second and helps more than you'd think. Keep going. More stories. Story 11. I've worked road maintenance for the state for 22 years, mostly on the secondary and tertiary mountain roads in the western part of the state. I drive a lot of remote road at a lot of different hours, including the overnight maintenance windows when we're patching or clearing. This is not a person who is scared by the dark. I'm in the dark mountain roads regularly for work, and I've been doing it long enough that the night in those mountains is as familiar to me as the day. This was a March night, around 2 in the morning, on a secondary road, through a hollow that I'd probably driven 300 times. My supervisor was with me that night because we were doing a culvert inspection in addition to patching. So I have a witness to what I'm about to describe. We came around a bend and a man was standing in the road, older by the look of him. He was wearing clothes that my supervisor, who is from that area and knows its history, said looked wrong for this decade. Not costume wrong, just slightly out of time. Dark clothing, the kind of shape and cut you see in old photographs. I stopped the truck. The man looked at us. My supervisor said his name quietly, not to me. Just said it to himself the way you do when you recognize something. I asked who that was, and my supervisor said it was his great uncle, who had died on this road in 1987. The man in the road turned and walked into the trees on the right shoulder, walked at normal pace, and was gone. My supervisor didn't say anything for a while. Then he said that his great uncle died in a logging accident in the hollow beside this road, and that the family had seen him on this road before. He said it the way you'd say something that was sad and ordinary at the same time. I didn't ask any more questions because it didn't feel like my business to ask. I've driven that road many times since. I haven't seen the man again. My supervisor retired 2 years ago. I never brought it up again after that night. Story 12. I keep bees on a hillside farm in Virginia and have for 18 years. I want to say that beekeepers develop a particular kind of patience and attention. Through the work, you spend a lot of hours watching things other people don't watch, and you stop being startled by what the natural world does. Because the natural world is constantly doing things that would unsettle people who don't watch it carefully. What I want to describe is something my bees did over 3 days in late August several years ago. My hives are positioned on the lower terrace of the hillside, backed up against the tree line of the national forest that borders my property to the east. I check them daily. On the first of those 3 days, every hive was oriented differently. Not the boxes, the bees themselves. The clusters inside each hive had moved to the side of the box, facing away from the forest. All 4 hives, every colony had moved away from the forest side. Bees don't do this for temperature regulation, at least not in late August, and not all 4 hives simultaneously. I went through all the obvious explanations: predator activity, a new chemical smell from the forest, vibration from logging. Nothing fit, and I know the signs for all of those things. The second day, the bees were agitated in a specific way I've seen before only once, and that was when a bear was in the area. But there was no bear, no tracks, no damage, nothing. Just agitated, not leaving the hives much, which is not August bee behavior. On the third day, I walked into the tree line to see if I could identify anything. 20 feet into the trees, I stopped walking. The air in there felt pressurized in a way I don't know how to explain better than that. Not that I was having a medical event, not that the temperature had changed, just that the quality of the air was different. I stood there for maybe a minute and then walked back out. The fourth day, the bees were back to normal. I've told this to one person, another beekeeper in the county who I respect. She said her hives had done the same thing years ago, and that when she asked an old-timer about it, he told her the bees know when something is close that isn't used to being seen. She asked what that meant, and he said exactly what it sounds like. Story 13, I'm a nurse practitioner at a rural health clinic in western North Carolina. I've been here for 6 years after doing my training in Charlotte and doing a stint at a hospital in Asheville. I tell you my professional background because a significant part of the story involves something I can not explain medically, and I want to be clear that I've tried. The patient I want to describe came in on a Tuesday in October. I won't use his real name. He was in his late 70s, lifelong resident of the county, came in for what his wife described as an episode the previous evening. He'd had what she called a wandering spell where he'd gotten up in the night and gone outside and been found by her son, standing in the yard staring up the ridge behind the house. Cognitively, the man was sharp. I tested him thoroughly. No signs of dementia, no confusion on orientation questions, good memory, completely clear on the conversation he was having with me. I asked him about the episode. He said he'd woken up because someone called his name. He was certain of this, not a dream, not his wife, not the television. Someone outside called his name, and he went to the door and then outside. He said when he got to the yard, he could see a figure at the tree line. I asked him to describe it. He said it was his father. His father had been dead for 31 years. I asked what the figure did. He said his father looked at him for a while, and then turned and pointed up into the woods toward the ridge. The man said he understood that his father was pointing to where the family cemetery was, where the man's father was buried. He said he stood there and looked at the cemetery direction for a while, and then his son was there next to him. He did not seem distressed by this. He was describing it the way you describe a significant but not alarming event, something worth noting, something to be taken seriously, but not something that frightened him. I found nothing wrong with him medically. His vitals were fine. I asked about sleep quality, stress, medications that could cause vivid waking states. None of it pointed to a straightforward clinical explanation. He came back to see me about 6 weeks later for an unrelated visit. I asked how he was doing. He said fine. He said he'd gone up to the cemetery the day after the episode and cleaned it up, cleared the brush, set the stones right that had fallen. He said it needed it, and he figured that was the message. I can document the clinical presentation, and I have. I cannot document a conclusion. That's where I'm leaving this. Story 14. I don't use the internet much, and my daughter helped me type this up because she thought I should send it in. I'm 71 years old, and I've lived in these mountains all my life, and the thing I want to say is that the mountains here are not quiet, the way people think they're quiet. There is something that moves in these hills. I don't know what it is, and I'm not going to claim to know. What I know is that it has been here longer than anyone I've ever talked to, and it will be here after all of us. My story isn't dramatic. I was walking behind my house early one morning in June, maybe 5 years ago, just after sunrise. I go out most mornings like that. On that morning, I came to the edge of the tree line, where it opens into the backfield, and I stopped. In the field, maybe 60 feet from me, there was a shape. Not a bear, not a deer, not anything I could categorize in 40-some years of being around wildlife in these mountains. It was low to the ground, and it was still, and it was looking at me. I can't tell you what its face looked like, because I couldn't make a face out of the looking. I can tell you that I felt looked at in a way I have not felt looked at by any animal before or since. We looked at each other for a long time. Then it moved into the field grass, and I couldn't see it anymore. I went inside and had my coffee and thought about it. I'm still thinking about it. My grandmother would have known what that was, I think. The people before my grandmother would have known what it was. Somewhere between then and now, that knowledge got lost, and now all I can say is, it was there. And it looked at me, and I looked back, and then it was gone. That's the whole story. I don't have an explanation. I've stopped needing one. Story 15. I was hiking alone on a trail in southern West Virginia. The kind of trail that gets enough use to stay clear, but not so much that you're ever going to run into other people on a random Wednesday. October. I'd been out for about 4 hours on what I planned as a 6-hour loop. At the turnaround point, there was a spring I knew about, and I stopped there to eat lunch and filter water. Nice spot, open sky above the spring, good light. I was there maybe 20 minutes. When I got up to start back, I noticed there was a man sitting on a log at the edge of the clearing, who hadn't been there when I sat down. I don't know when he arrived. I'd been sitting facing the direction the trail came from, and I'd heard nothing. He was older, heavily bearded, wearing work clothes. He said good afternoon, and I said good afternoon. He asked how the trail ahead was, and I said it had been good, no issues. He said he was glad to hear it and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, without any change in tone, that I was going to want to make sure I was off the ridge before it got dark, not as a threat. The way an experienced person tells you a practical piece of information. I said I was planning to be done well before dark. He said good. He said this particular stretch of ridge was not one where you wanted to be when the light changed. I asked why. He looked at me with an expression that was not unfriendly but was completely serious, and said that some things in these mountains have been here since before there were people to name them, and they don't need a reason. He said it was not dangerous if you kept to the timing. I thanked him and left. I made good time back and was at the trailhead a solid 90 minutes before sunset. I went back to look up the trail register when I got home out of curiosity. The trail I was on required signing in. There was no entry for that day other than my own. That's all of them for today. Genuinely thank you to every single person who wrote in this channel. Is your stories, and I'm just the one reading them. If you've got something to share, the submission link is always in the description. Subscribe if you haven't, more videos coming, and I'll see you in the next one. Story 16. I work nights at a paper mill about 30 miles east of the Tennessee border in Virginia, and I drive a back road through the mountains to get there, 40 minutes each way, 5 nights a week. I've driven that road for 9 years, at every hour the night has to offer. I know its curves. I know where the deer come out. I know where the cell signal drops and where it comes back. About 4 years in, I noticed something I couldn't account for. There is a section of the road, exactly the same section every time, where my truck's temperature gauge drops. Not the outside temperature display, the engine temperature. It drops about 8 degrees over maybe a quarter mile, and then returns to normal before I've finished the thought about it. I mentioned it to my mechanic. He checked the thermostat, the coolant system, everything that could cause a temperature fluctuation. The truck was fine. He drove the road once with me and watched it happen and said he didn't know what to tell me. A woman I work with who grew up in the area and has driven that road her whole life said without blinking that it dropped there because the road went through a cold place. I asked what she meant. She said her grandmother had called it a cold place, a spot in the mountains where the warmth of the world doesn't reach all the way in. She said it was true of the road, and also true of the creek bottom the road crossed just at that point. She said the cold places in these mountains have always been there, and they're not something you try to explain. They're just something you learn to recognize. Story 17. My name is not important, and my location I'll keep vague, because some of what I'm about to describe could embarrass my employer if it were connected to me directly. I'm a geologist. I do field survey work for a firm that does contract assessment for mining and extraction interests in the Appalachians. There is a location in the range, or I will say it's in the tri-state area of Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky, where my survey equipment behaves incorrectly. Not incorrectly in a way that has a mechanical explanation. I have had every instrument I've taken to that location serviced and recalibrated before and after visits. They perform correctly everywhere else I take them. At this location, compass readings rotate without explanation. GPS units return positions that are inconsistent with each other and with known landmarks. And on 2 occasions, my magnetometer produced readings that a physicist colleague who reviewed the data blind said were physically impossible given the geology of the area. I have been back to this location 6 times over 4 years, trying to characterize what is happening. I cannot. The readings are not consistent with any mineral deposit profile I know of. They're not consistent with any geological feature I can identify by survey or by eye. The rock is unremarkable visually, standard Appalachian sedimentary formation, nothing anomalous to look at. My firm knows the location produces problematic survey data. They have declined to include it in the assessment package we were originally contracted to produce, and have noted it as a non-assessable zone for reasons of instrument reliability. That's the professional handling of it. What I know personally is that I have been to many remote and difficult field locations in my career, and the only location where I've ever wanted to leave before my survey was complete is that one. Not because of any specific event, just a consistent or reproducible sense that the work I was doing there was not welcome. Story 18. I taught elementary school for 26 years in a small mountain community in eastern Tennessee Small school, the kind where you teach the children and then eventually teach their children, where, the families and the family histories going back. I retired 4 years ago. What I want to write about is a student I had twice first in third grade. When I taught third grade, and then in fifth grade, the year I moved up. I'll call her Lena. She was an unusually quiet child. Not socially, but internally, she had a stillness to her that was noticeable in a room of children who are generally not still. In third grade, Lena drew the same picture repeatedly. It was the specific hill behind her family's property, I learned later. And on the hill there was a figure that she drew consistently, long and dark, and standing at the top. I asked her once what the figure was, and she said it was the Watcher. I asked if the Watcher was scary, and she thought about it for a moment with the seriousness that some children bring to questions adults ask casually, and then said, "No, the Watcher was just watching." She said it had always been there. I spoke with her parents about the picture because repeated imagery is something teachers pay attention to. Her mother, a practical woman, a nurse, said that Lena had been pointing at the hill since she was old enough to point, and that the whole family was used to it. She said the older women in her husband's family said there had always been something at that hill, and that it was not a bad thing, just an old thing, and that some children could see it more clearly than others. In fifth grade, Lena was the same child, the same stillness. She drew the figure less by then. When I asked, she said she didn't need to draw it as much because she'd gotten better at just knowing it was there. I think about Lena sometimes and I don't know what she could see on that hill. I know that she saw something consistently for years, and that the adults around her treated it as information about the place rather than a symptom to be corrected. I've turned that over many times in my retirement. It seems like the right approach, whatever the thing on the hill was. Story 19. I'm a hunting guide with about 15 years of experience taking clients into the backcountry in the mountains of southwestern Virginia. What I know about those mountains is practical topography, seasonal patterns, animal behavior, the difference between a noise that means something and a noise that doesn't. I had a client 3 years ago, a corporate attorney from Northern Virginia, first time hunting anything bigger than a duck. Good enough person, not woodsy, but not someone who complained. We were set up in a blind on a hardwood ridge well before dawn, waiting for first light and the deer movement that comes with it. Around first light, he nudged me and pointed to the left of our blind. About 40 yards into the trees, there was something moving. I looked, and what I saw was not a deer. It was moving through the trees at about waist height on me, which would put it close to the ground, and it was moving fast and low, faster than deer move in brush when they're not spooked. And the way it moved, I've thought about this a lot, was wrong for any quadruped I know. Not wrong in a big dramatic way, just slightly wrong. The rhythm of the movement slightly off from any pattern I recognized. I put my hand on my client's arm. We both watched it cross through the trees and disappear into the hollow to the east. It was gone in maybe 8 seconds. He asked me what it was. I told him I didn't know. He asked if it was dangerous. I told him I didn't think so, but I was going to watch the hollow for a while before we moved. We stayed in the blind for another hour. Nothing else happened. I've never seen it again. I've been a hunting guide for 15 years. I've identified animals from partial glimpses in poor light at significant distances more times than I can count. Whatever moved through those trees is not in any category I can draw from. I've asked 2 other guides I know well, both of whom have more years than me in those specific mountains. And one of them said he'd had a client describe the same movement in a hollow. about 8 miles from where we were, and that he'd put it down to a running coyote until he thought about the movement more carefully, and then he'd stop putting it down to anything. Story 20. I want to preface this by saying I'm not a person who believes in the supernatural. I'm a data analyst. My professional life involves assessing what the evidence supports and what it doesn't. I'm writing this because the alternative is not writing it, and not writing it felt dishonest to myself. I was driving through the mountains on a vacation trip. I'll say it was somewhere in the central Appalachians, taking the scenic route, because I had the time and the mountain roads are worth taking when you have the time. Late afternoon, still light, no reason to feel anything other than pleasant. I stopped at a pullout to take a photograph of the valley view. Got out of the car. The view was exactly as good as it looked like it would be. I had my camera up, and then I had an overwhelming and specific feeling, not of vague unease, not a flutter of anxiety, but a direct and pointed sensation that I should not photograph what I was seeing. Not couldn't, not that anything was stopping me, just that I should not. That photographing it was wrong in a way that had nothing to do with light conditions or composition. I stood there with the camera up for probably 30 seconds. Then I put the camera down and just looked at the valley. And the sensation shifted into something that I can only describe as correct, like putting a book back on its shelf. The valley was there, I was looking at it without trying to capture it, and that was the right configuration of things. I've told almost no one this story because I cannot frame it in a way that doesn't sound either precious or unstable. What I can tell you is that I felt a distinction, clearly and physically, between a thing I should do and a thing I should not do, and that following the distinction felt like it mattered. To what, I don't know. To something. Story 21. I'm a wildland firefighter. Worked fire seasons in the Appalachians for 7 years before I moved to the West Coast for bigger assignments. You spend a lot of time in those mountains working fire, and you get to know the terrain in a particular way, thermal, tactical. You're always reading the land for how fire will move through it. My second season, I was on a small crew doing a controlled burn in a section of national forest in North Carolina. Prescribed fire, the plan was solid. Conditions were right, experienced crew. We'd been working the line since morning, and we were in good shape going into the afternoon. About 3 in the afternoon, the burn boss stopped the operation and had us pull back to the road. No explanation at first. I got to him after we'd assembled and asked what was up. He was a man with 20-some years of firework in those mountains, and the kind of calm that only comes from that specific tenure. He said the fire had started listening. I said, I didn't know what that meant. He said sometimes in these mountains, a fire will shift from burning according to conditions into burning according to something else, and that when it starts doing that, you pull your people back and wait and don't try to fight it. He said it wasn't dangerous if you gave it room. He said the forest knew how to manage itself, and occasionally you had to let it. The fire burned in a perfect ring around a section of the hillside that we hadn't burned and had not been in the prescription. The ring was clean as any hand line, and it stopped exactly at the boundary of that section and didn't cross. The burn boss wrote in his incident report that wind shifts had altered the burn behavior. I read that report. That's what it said. He and I have never discussed the other thing, but I've thought about it for every season since. Story 22. I've lived in the same farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania, near the Maryland border all my life. 63 years in the same house, on the same land that my grandfather built. The Appalachians in that part are old and low, more like great hills than mountains compared to further south, and they have a particular quality of oldness to them that I think comes from being worn down rather than still reaching up. What I want to tell happened when I was about 30. I was putting up a fence on the north pasture in May, by myself, good working weather. I was driving stakes with a post driver and making good progress. I hit a section of ground near the edge of the woodlot where the post driver made a different sound. Not the solid thunk of hitting earth, a hollow sound like hitting something beneath the surface. I dug down about 18 inches with a spade. There was a flat stone, about 2 feet by 3 feet, smooth, clearly not a natural formation, in the glacial till of that area. I cleared around it and found it was a lid of some kind. It sat on mortared fieldstone walls, going down further than I could see in the hole I'd opened. I went and got my neighbor, who is practical and unflappable, and has farmed that country for as long as I have. We went back and dug more. What we found was a chamber, roughly 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, perhaps 4 feet deep, constructed with obvious care and lined with flat stones. No doors, no hinges, no wood remaining. Whatever wood had covered it or been inside it was long gone. The construction looked old, how old neither of us could say. It was empty. I called the County Historical Society. A woman came out and looked at it. She said she'd seen similar things in the area, said the best theory was a colonial-era cold storage or possibly something pre-colonial. Couldn't say more than that. I covered it back up with the flat stone and poured a concrete slab over that, and put the fence post in, and never mentioned it again. I mention it now because I've wondered ever since whether covering it was the right decision. The construction was too careful for mere storage. Someone built that chamber with intention. I put it back in the ground and poured concrete over it, and I've gone on living on top of it for over 30 years. Some nights I think about what it was for, and whether the thing it was for is still being done in whatever way things get done without people. Story 23. I've been a mail carrier on a rural route in the Virginia Highlands for 14 years. You know a road when you've driven it every weekday for 14 years, regardless of weather. You know where the pavement heaves in winter and where the culvert washes out in spring and where the morning light hits at a particular angle that makes you squint. You know the people on the road and roughly where they are in their lives. There's a stretch of my route that passes through a cut in a ridge. The road goes through a gap where the ridge was blasted through, probably 100 years ago. It's about a quarter mile of cut, stone walls on both sides, maybe 30 feet high at the deepest point. Perfectly ordinary piece of mountain road. Twice in 14 years, I have passed through that cut and come out on the other side having lost time. Not a significant amount the first time, about 11 minutes. The second time, about 9 minutes. Both times my truck showed no issue and I had no medical symptoms. I was not drowsy. I had no experience of anything happening. I drove into the cut and I drove out of the cut. And when I checked the clock on my dashboard, it was further forward than it should have been given how long the quarter mile takes to drive. I'm not a person who reads things into experiences. I told my husband about the first time, and he suggested I look at the clock more carefully on future passes. I did. On over 3,000 subsequent passes through that cut, I have lost no time. Twice in 14 years. I don't know what that means. I don't know if it means anything. I know that the 2 times it happened are recorded in my memory with more clarity and precision than most events, the way certain experiences fix themselves more firmly than ordinary things. Whatever it was, it mattered in some way I cannot quantify. Story 24. I want to tell you something that my grandfather told me, and that I've spent most of my adult life trying to decide whether to believe. He was a coal miner in West Virginia for 30 years, starting in the 1950s. He worked deep seam mines in the southern coal fields, and he was a practical, quiet man who didn't say things he didn't mean. He told me that deep in certain mines and certain sections that were old and went far back into the mountain, there were sounds that didn't belong to the mine. Not the sounds of the mine working, not creak and shift and water, different sounds. He described them as voices, but not in any language. More like the sound of a crowd heard through a wall, the presence of language without the content. He said certain miners refused to work certain sections because of it. He said the foreman knew and looked the other way about the reassignments. He said once, and only once, he was working alone at the face of a section that was known for the sounds, and he heard them very clearly, closer than usual. He stopped working and listened. He said after a minute they stopped, and then a section of the wall about 20 feet to his left collapsed. Nothing he would have survived if he'd been there. He said he thanked whatever had spoken and kept working that day. I've thought about this my whole life. Maybe the sounds were gas movement, or the geological stress of the mountain, or acoustics doing something strange in the scene. Maybe my grandfather attributed meaning to coincidence, because the alternative was that it was random and the randomness was worse. I don't know. What I know is that he told me this story once with the deliberateness he reserved for things he meant as lessons. And he said the mountains have their own voice, and the respectful thing is to learn when it's speaking. Story 25. I'm a retired military officer 20 years in, and I have the kind of mind that was built for and by that career, structured, skeptical of unverifiable claims, oriented toward what can be confirmed rather than what can be imagined. I want to be clear about that before I tell you what happened, because I think it matters. I moved back to the Appalachian region where I grew up after retirement. My wife and I bought property in a rural county and have been there 4 years. Good life, good community. Our property backs up to a state forest. We have about 800 feet of shared boundary with the forest along the back of our land. I walk that line frequently. 8 months ago, I was doing the backline walk on a clear morning in November. Good visibility, no wind. Conditions for observation as good as conditions get. At the boundary in the state forest, maybe 50 feet in from the fence line, there was a structure. Not large, about 4 feet high and roughly square, built from branches that had been broken rather than cut. No tool marks. The branches were woven together in a way that was deliberate and consistent. The whole thing was oriented so that the opening faced east, toward the rising sun. It had been there long enough that leaves had collected against its base, but not so long that the structure had deteriorated. The branches were still flexible, still green at the breakpoints, maybe a few weeks old. I walked the boundary in both directions for a quarter mile. Nothing else. I went back the next day. The structure was the same the day after and the day after that. 2 weeks later, I went to check and it was gone. No debris, no fallen branches, nothing remaining in the site to indicate it had been there. I spent 20 years being trained to assess what I see with precision. What I saw was a deliberately constructed structure in a remote state forest with no explanation for who built it, why it was there, or where it went. I have not been able to improve on that assessment in 8 months. I've filed it under observed unresolved. Hey, quick break. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is a good time to do that. We're putting out more Appalachian videos and you'll want to catch them. Hit subscribe. Takes 2 seconds. Back to it. Story 26. My father was a timber framer. He built barns and houses all through the West Virginia mountains for 40 years and knew the land the way tradespeople know it, practically spatially, by what it could hold. He passed a few years ago, and I'm sending this story in for him because he told it to me a dozen times over the years, and always with the same details, which is the mark of a true memory. He was framing a bank barn on a property in a rural county early in his career, maybe 1974. He and his crew were working alone on the site the property owners had gone into town. Midday, August. His crew heard someone in the upper level of the frame footsteps, the specific sound of a person walking on fresh-laid joists. There was nobody on the property except the crew, all of whom were accounted for on the ground level. He sent his apprentice up to check. The apprentice came back down and said there was nobody up there, but that a chalk line had been moved, repositioned, and that the new position was more accurate than the one they'd marked that morning. He went up himself, checked every part of the upper frame. Nobody there. Chalk line exactly as the apprentice had described, moved to a more precise line. He said they finished the barn, and it was one of the truest structures he ever built. He said years later he told the property owner about it. The owner said his grandfather had framed a barn on the same site before the current one, and had been known in the county as the best timber framer of his generation. He said his grandfather was buried in the family cemetery on the hill above the barn site. My father was not a superstitious man. He told that story as a fact, which is how I'm repeating it. Story 27. I was 17 years old, which I mention because 17-year-olds are not, in my experience, reliable narrators of experience in general. I know that. I've been 41 for 3 years now, and I've turned this memory over many times, and it is consistent. The details don't shift the way memories usually shift when you rehearse them. I was turkey hunting with my uncle in the mountains of North Carolina on a May morning. Pre-dawn start as turkey hunting requires. We split up to cover more ground, not ideal protocol for a 17-year-old, but I'd been going out with him since I was 12 and we were comfortable with it. I was set up against a tree above a small saddle in the ridge, calling on a mouth call, waiting for light. As the light came up, I became aware of something in the saddle below me. Not a turkey, not a deer, not anything whose shape was familiar to me then and is not familiar to me now. I was calm. I want to be clear about that because I think fear sometimes edits accounts of this kind. I was not afraid. I was alert, the way you're alert to something that requires your full attention. I watched it for what I estimate was between 4 and 7 minutes. It did not look up at me. It moved through the saddle, doing something I couldn't interpret, not feeding, not traveling, something purposeful that I didn't have a category for. Then it was gone. Over the far ridge and away, I wouldn't have thought possible from its size, quickly and without sound. I met my uncle at the agreed point at 7. I described what I'd seen. He asked me how long I'd watched it. I said several minutes. He said that was longer than most people. He did not seem surprised and he did not ask me many questions, which at 17 I found both reassuring and slightly unsettling. He's never wanted to talk about it more than that. I've respected that. Story 28. I'm a photographer, mostly landscape and nature work, and some editorial. I've spent a lot of time in the Appalachians over the past 12 years for professional reasons. The light there is extraordinary, and the terrain rewards patience. There is one image I've never published and never shown to anyone outside my immediate family. I haven't deleted it, and I don't intend to. It was taken in the North Carolina mountains in late afternoon October. I was shooting a view down a valley. Nothing unusual, good light. I shot about 40 frames over 30 minutes from the same general position. Normal workflow. When I processed the frames at home, there was one image frame 23 in the sequence that contained something in the midground and a gap between two ridges that was not visible in frames 22 or 24. The exposures on either side were 1-second intervals. Whatever was in frame 23 was not there for at least 1 second on either side of that image. The shape in the frame is not a bird. It is not a known aircraft. It is not lens flare or artifact. I have enough experience with my equipment to rule those out confidently. It is a shape that is present, sharp, correctly exposed for the ambient light conditions of that moment, and unidentifiable. I've shown it to 2 photographers I trust, and who would not be kind about lens artifacts or post-processing mistakes. Neither of them has an explanation. One of them said the shape looked like it was looking toward the camera. I haven't been able to think about that description without discomfort. Story 29. I grew up in a coal camp in the southern West Virginia coalfields, the kind of place that was already in decline by the time I was a kid in the 80s, the kind of place that barely exists anymore, except as a name on a map if it makes the maps at all. The community I'm describing is gone now, essentially a few houses left, the rest reclaimed by the hillside. The thing I want to tell about is the foreman's house. There was a foreman's house on the upper end of the camp that had been empty my whole childhood. Everyone knew not to go near it. Not a formal prohibition, no fence, no sign, just something that was understood. The children in the camp understood it without being told explicitly, which is how children understand things in communities that carry information in their behavior rather than their speech. When I was about 12, I asked my grandmother why nobody went to the foreman's house. She was quiet for a moment and then said, the house had bad memory. I asked what that meant. She said some buildings remember things that happened in them, and that this one remembered things that weren't good to be around. Years later, I was grown and gone and came back to do genealogy research in the county records. I found the history of the camp. The foreman of that camp in the 1920s had been involved in the labor violence of that era on the company side, not the workers' side. I found records that suggested events in or near that house that I won't describe here in detail, but that were not good. I don't believe buildings have memory in any literal sense. I believe trauma becomes part of how communities relate to places, and I believe that relationship can be transmitted without explicit description. But I also think my grandmother's description, bad memory, is as accurate a description of some places as any more clinical framing. And I'm not sure the clinical framing captures something that hers does. Story 30. I'm a park ranger at a state park in Western Maryland, going on my 7th year. I've worked at 3 different parks in the region, and the one I'm at now is the oldest, and the one with the most complex historical use. The land has been farmed, logged, mined, used for various things, going back several hundred years before being acquired for the park. We get a class of incident at this park that we don't really have a formal category for in our reporting system. I've started calling them in my own notes attention events. It's the best description I have. They typically involve visitors in a specific section of the park, a back section that sees light use, away from the main facilities. Visitors will come to the ranger station and report that someone spoke to them on the trail in that section and then wasn't there when they turned to respond, or that they heard their name called, or that they saw a person walking ahead of them on the trail who disappeared when the trail offered no cover to disappear into. The reports are consistent in their quality, meaning the people giving them are generally calm, generally somewhat skeptical of their own experience, and generally framing it as something that happened to them, rather than something they're claiming a larger interpretation of. Most of them don't use the word ghost, they just describe what happened. I know that section of trail. I've walked it hundreds of times. It's a pleasant section of trail. Nothing about it suggests anything other than a pleasant section of trail. And every year, a handful of people come out of it having had an experience that is in the reports. I've stopped trying to find the ordinary explanation. The section has its attention events, and the visitors have them, and they come out and tell me about them, and I thank them for letting me know and write it up and file it. That's as much resolution as I've been able to find. Story 31. My wife and I hiked a trail in Virginia on our honeymoon 18 years ago. The trail went up to a bald, those grassy open summits you get in the southern Appalachians. And the view from the top was supposed to be worth the climb. It was. We spent about an hour at the summit. On the way down on a section of trail that was shaded and steep, we both stopped at the same moment without the other initiating it. We both heard the same thing. A sound, I'm going to describe it as a low hum, though that doesn't quite get it. It was more structured than a hum, and more sustained than any sound I knew how to attribute to the environment. It felt like it was coming from the hillside to our left, not from any point source, but from the whole face of the slope. We looked at each other. My wife said, "Can you hear that?" I said, "Yes." We stood there listening. It continued for about 2 minutes and then faded. When it faded, the silence felt different from the silence before it, the way a room feels different after everyone has left, even when nothing has changed physically. We talked about it for the rest of the hike and for years after. We never agreed on what it was. I've always thought it was some geological process, gas or water moving through the rock, in a way that produced resonance. My wife has always said she thinks it was something that knew we were there. We went back for our 10th anniversary and hiked the same trail. We stopped at the same place on the way down. Nothing happened. The slope was quiet and ordinary. We stood there for a while, just in case. I still don't know what we heard. What I know is that both of us heard it at the same moment, without prompting each other, and that neither of us has ever heard anything like it since, in 18 years of hiking. Story 32. I'm a long-haul trucker, and my regular route takes me through the Appalachian Mountains on US 19 and some of the connecting routes between Georgia and Ohio. I've been doing this route for 11 years. There is a section of road, I'll tell you it's in West Virginia, that's close enough, where I have seen 5 separate times over 11 years the same woman. She's walking on the shoulder in the same direction of travel, same side of the road, same general stretch of about 2 miles. Older woman, white hair, walking steadily. She doesn't look up when I pass. The first time I slowed down to check if she needed help, by the time I'd found a safe place to turn around, she wasn't on the road. There's no place to turn off or pull over in that stretch. No houses, no driveways, no woods access within easy reach. She was simply gone from the road. The second time I looked in my mirrors as I passed, she walked into the tree line on the left side of the road, the east side, going uphill. That tree line is a steep slope. People don't walk into it. I slowed down but didn't stop, and she was gone. The other 3 times I noted the time and the date in my logbook. Same stretch of road, same woman, same direction. I've told other drivers who do this route, and 2 of them have seen her. One of them described her exactly right before I described her to him. I don't have a theory, I have an observation. Same woman, 5 times, 11 years, 2 miles, of US 19 in West Virginia. She's real or she isn't, and I've seen her 5 times, so as far as I'm concerned, she's real. What real means in this context is not my area. Story 33. I work for a utility company doing line inspection in the mountains of western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee. Helicopter-based inspection for the most part, low and slow over the lines. I've been doing it for 8 years. From the air, the Appalachians look different. You see them as a system. The ridge and valley pattern is much more apparent. You see the drainage networks, the way the settlements cluster along the valley floors, the way the ridges push everything to certain corridors. It's a geography that makes more sense from above. I mention this because what I want to tell you involves what I saw from the air rather than on the ground. On an inspection run about 3 years ago, clear morning, October, I was running a line through a remote section of ridge national forest on both sides. No roads, no structures. Typical backcountry. I was maybe 400 feet above the ridge crest. On the ridge, in a flat clearing in the trees, there was a pattern on the ground. Not natural. It covered an area I estimated at roughly 2 acres. Lines in the vegetation, curves in what might have been cleared or differently maintained ground cover, making a pattern that was too regular and too elaborate to be accidental. It was not a meadow. It was not fire damage. It was a deliberate pattern on the surface of the ridge. I circled twice and got as much of a look as the flight path allowed. Then, we had to continue the inspection. I reported it to my supervisor as a potential unauthorized land clearing activity. He filed it with the Forest Service. I never heard anything further. I've flown over that ridge a dozen times since, and I've never been able to locate the clearing again. Which may mean it was on a slightly different line than I remember, or may mean something else. I couldn't tell you which. Story 34. I've been a caver. Spelunking is the amateur term. We say caving for about 20 years, primarily in the karst systems of Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky. The Appalachians have extraordinary cave systems, some of the most extensive in the eastern United States, and a lot of them are in areas without much access or survey. I've been in enough caves to know what caves sound like and what they feel like. The acoustics, the temperature gradients, the quality of the dark, the specific way water moves through stone. I'm at home underground in a way that took years to build and that I value. There is a cave system in Virginia that I have been in twice and will not go back to. I'm not going to give a location because this cave is on private property and the landowner doesn't want traffic, and I'm going to respect that. What the cave does, and I say does, because it is consistent and reproducible and not a function of my mental state on a particular day, is generate a feeling in a specific gallery about 400 feet from the entrance of being watched, not a vague caving nervousness, a specific located, directed feeling of being observed from a particular point in the gallery, the northeast wall, high up, near the ceiling. I've been to that gallery twice with different partners. The first time, my partner stopped at the same moment I did without me saying anything, looked at the northeast wall, and said quietly that he wanted to leave the gallery. We did. The second time, a different partner. Same thing. Same wall, unprompted, same quiet statement. Both of them are experienced cavers who are not given to unease underground. I've surveyed the northeast wall as carefully as I could from a distance. There's a passage there, high up, that we haven't mapped. It's above reach without equipment we didn't have. I don't know what's up there. I know that whatever is up there or behind the wall is aware of visitors in that gallery. I'll map the rest of the system eventually. That gallery I'm leaving alone. Story 35. My family is from a small community in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. I live in Louisville now and have for 20 years. Go back a few times a year. This is a story my mother's aunt, who was 91 years old when she told it to me, told me the last time I visited her, a few months before she passed. She said when she was a young woman, which would have been the 1940s, there was an old man who lived up the hollow above their community, who her family called the Listener. Not as a nickname exactly, as a description of what he did. She said he would sit on a certain flat rock above the creek and listen. That was it. He'd go up there and sit and listen. She said people in the community knew that if something was going to happen, a hard winter, a flood, a death in the area, something significant, the old man would come down from the rock a day or two before and do something specific. He would visit every house in the community and wish each family well. Just come to the door and say he hoped they were all well and that he was thinking of them. Then he'd go back up. She said every time he made those visits, something happened. Every time without exception in the years she remembered him. I asked what he was listening to on the rock. She thought about it the way she thought about things, slowly, from several directions, and said she thought he was listening to what the mountain knew. She said some people in those mountains could do that and most couldn't, and that it was a particular kind of gift that came with a particular kind of loneliness. I don't know what to do with this story except to hold it carefully, which is what I've been doing since she told me. We're going to keep going. Thank you for sticking with these. If you've got your own story from the mountains or anywhere else, link is in the description. We get to everything. Story 36. I'm a botanist at a university in the southeast. I do fieldwork in the southern Appalachians, studying endemic plant communities, plants that exist only in this specific range and nowhere else on Earth. The endemism of the Appalachians is extraordinary for temperate North America. The isolation of the range during the last ice age produced speciation that makes certain communities of plants completely unique. I tell you my professional background because the thing I wanted to describe is something I observed in my capacity as a trained observer of plant communities. And I want that to be clear. There is a specific type of community, a high elevation spray cliff community, fed by seepage and waterfall, that I have worked in for 15 years. These communities have a quality of ancientness that other ecologists have noted in the literature. They are refugia in the truest sense, places where Ice Age species survived and still survive in isolation. On a visit to one of my study sites 4 years ago, I had an experience I have not published and do not plan to publish. I was working alone on the cliff face, doing my standard transect work. The spray cliff community I was in had been developing in its current form for, at minimum, several thousand years, possibly longer. At some point in the mid-morning, I had a feeling I'm going to be precise about how I'm describing this. A feeling of being in the presence of accumulated time. Not a metaphor. A physical sensation, like pressure, but without the unpleasantness of pressure. Like standing at the edge of a very large body of water and feeling its weight without it harming you. The community around me felt continuous, in a way that the word old doesn't capture. It felt ongoing in a timescale that had no reference to the timescale I was working in. It lasted about 3 minutes. I sat down on the rock and let it complete. When it passed, I went back to work and finished the transect. I've tried to describe it to one colleague and found I couldn't do it without it sounding like a spiritual experience, which is not the framework I want to use. It was an observation. The community communicated something about its own continuity that I was briefly able to receive. That's the most accurate description I can give. Story 37. I run the small general store that my family has run for 3 generations in a mountain community in Virginia. I'm the 3rd generation. My grandfather started it after World War II. My mother ran it for 30 years, and I took it on when she retired. The store is a repository of the community's memory in a way that most businesses aren't. People have been coming here for 70 years. The older customers knew my grandfather. A few of the very old ones remember before the store, which is hard to imagine but true. The building holds something because of that continuity. The thing I want to tell is about a regular customer I had for the first several years. I was running the store on my own. An older woman came in twice a week like clockwork, always bought the same things, always paid in cash, always very kind in a reserved and specific way. The kind of kindness that has been earned through something rather than just being a personality trait. After about 3 years, she stopped coming in. I thought nothing of it at first. Health, travel, any number of things can stop an older customer from coming in. After 2 months, I asked another longtime customer if she knew what had happened. The other customer gave me a look I still think about and said that woman had passed. I asked when. She said about a week before I'd last seen her in the store. I don't know what to do with that. I know who I sold things to twice a week for 3 years, and I know the woman the other customer described as the same person. The timeline doesn't resolve, and I've stopped trying to make it. My mother, when I told her, said that the store has always had customers who came in after they were gone. She said my grandfather had mentioned it. She said it wasn't something to be afraid of, and it wasn't something to advertise, and it was just part of being a place that people had relied on for long enough. Story 38. I was working at a summer camp in the North Carolina mountains when I was 22. Counselor for a cabin of 12-year-olds. Typical summer job between college and figuring out what I was doing with my life. The camp was in a beautiful spot, deep in the national forest, well run, nothing unusual about it. One night, about 3 weeks into the session, I was doing the late rounds, checking that kids were in their cabins, doing a perimeter walk, standard nighttime duty, clear night, warm, not late, maybe 10:30. On my second lap of the perimeter, I heard a child crying in the woods off the edge of the camp property. Not close, maybe 40 or 50 feet into the trees. I stopped and listened. It was clearly a child crying, the specific sound of a child who is frightened and alone, rather than the sound of a child who is in pain or hurt. The kind of crying that meant lost, I thought, or scared in the dark. I went back to get the head counselor before going into the trees. That was the protocol. Never go off property alone at night. The head counselor came with me and we went into the woods toward the sound. The sound stopped when we were about 20 feet from the property line. Not abruptly, it faded over maybe 10 seconds. The way sound fades when its source moves away. We stood there and listened and called into the dark, and there was nothing. We checked every cabin. All children were accounted for. All 12-year-olds asleep or pretending to be asleep as 12-year-olds are. No camp child had been in those woods. The head counselor, who had worked at that camp for 11 seasons, said to me on the way back that they heard a child in those woods a few times a summer. She said nobody had ever found the source. She said it was the one thing about the camp she'd never talked to the owners about because she didn't know what they'd do with the information. Story 39. I'm a stonemason who does restoration work in rural Appalachia. A lot of what I do is old foundations, old chimneys, old fieldstone structures that have been there for 150 or 200 years and need skilled hands. I've restored structures in every state in the range. What I've found over 20 years of this work is that old stonework has a record in it, not mystically structurally. The way the stones are laid tells you about the person who laid them, about their skill level, their habits of construction, their relationship to the material. You can identify individual builders across multiple structures the same way you'd identify a writer's voice. I can read a stone wall the way a musicologist reads a score. The thing I want to report is about a foundation I was hired to stabilize in Western Virginia, on a property that had been in the same family since the 1820s. Old structure, a root cellar under what had been the original house. My job was to repoint the joints and shore up a section that had heaved in a freeze cycle. When I got into the foundation work, I found something I've found once before in old Appalachian construction: a warding stone. A flat stone, not a construction stone too smooth. Wrong shape for a structural roll placed face down in the wall at a specific location. Marked on the underside with a carved symbol that I've now seen in 3 different structures in 3 different states. I documented it and put it back exactly as I found it. The owner asked what I'd found, and I showed her the photograph. She went to a box of old family papers and found a letter from the 1880s that mentioned the foundation contained a keeping stone that must not be disturbed. It used the phrase, "the old way." She didn't know what that meant. I didn't either, not fully. But I know enough from 20 years of this work to know that the people who built these structures built them with intention, and that the intentions were sometimes more than structural. I put the stone back because that seemed right. I put the other 2 back too, and other structures. I figure if they've been doing whatever they're doing for 150 years, I'm not the one who should stop them. Story 40. I've lived on the same stretch of road in eastern Tennessee for 47 years. I say that not as a credential, but as an explanation for why I'm confident in what I'm about to tell you. 47 years on a road means you know the road. You know what uses it and when and why. The road I live on has a section about a quarter mile north of my house that nobody I know will walk past on foot at night. Not me, not my neighbors, not the people I've asked over the years. It's not a formally known or discussed thing. People just don't do it, the way they don't do other things that don't need explaining. The road is fine otherwise. People walk on it in the daytime. People drive on it at all hours. At night on foot, that quarter mile is simply not done. I asked my husband's grandmother about it once, years ago, before she passed at 94. She was from a family that had been in that county before there was a county. She said that quarter mile of road followed a path that had been used long before it was a road, and that what used the path before it was a road still used it. She said it wasn't dangerous and it wasn't something to be afraid of. She said it was just something you gave the right of way. I've thought about that framing for years. Giving the right of way, like a courtesy, like a recognition that something else has a legitimate claim on that space at night, and you acknowledge it rather than contest it. 47 years. I have never walked that stretch at night. I don't intend to, not because I'm afraid, but because my husband's grandmother was a woman who knew what she was talking about and gave me information I decided to trust. Story 41. I'm an archaeologist. I specialize in eastern woodland sites and I've been doing field surveys in the Appalachians for going on 18 years. I want to be very careful about how I phrase this because my professional credibility matters to me, and I'm aware of how easily this kind of account can be dismissed. There is a site type that occurs in the Appalachians that I have encountered in several locations, and that is not well represented in the published literature. I'll describe what I've found, and I'll tell you what I've experienced at these sites, and I'll leave it to whoever is reading this to do with those two things what they will. The sites are elevated usually near ridge crests, sometimes on outcrops. They contain evidence of long, continuous use that spans many cultural periods, from the archaic through the contact era, and in the right stratigraphic conditions, the sequences are extraordinary. People came to these places repeatedly over thousands of years, for reasons that in several cases appear to have nothing to do with subsistence, no evidence of food processing, no storage features, tool assemblages that suggest activities we'd associate with ceremony or gathering rather than daily use. The sites are also consistently among the most difficult field experiences I've had. Not because of terrain or access, because of an ambient quality I've struggled to put in professional language for 18 years. What I've eventually settled on in my private notes, not my publications, is that these sites are still active. Not in any human sense. In some other sense that I can't define with the tools my training gave me. The accumulation of repeated human presence over thousands of years at a place chosen for reasons that were felt rather than material seems to have produced something. A character to the site, a quality of attention. I work at them as professionally as I can, and I write up my results in the standard way. I also acknowledge privately that the people who used these sites over all those centuries understood something about them that I am measuring the edges of without being able to see the whole. Story 42. I'm a painter, landscapes mostly. I've been painting the Appalachians specifically for 12 years, and they are, in my assessment, among the most painted and simultaneously most misunderstood landscapes in North America. Most painters render the visible, the light on the ridges, the mist in the hollows, the color of the seasons. There is something else in those mountains that the visible rendering misses completely. I'm going to try to describe it in the only language I have for it, which is visual. The mountains have a quality of self-regard, not the way a person regards themselves, something slower and less personal. Like the way an old building in winter holds its heat, not actively, not intentionally, but as a function of having accumulated something over a long time that it no longer releases easily. The mountains hold attention, their own attention, not ours. I've been trying to paint what I mean by that for 12 years. I haven't gotten it yet. Every time I think I'm close, I realize I've just painted a landscape. What I can tell you is that there are specific places in the mountains where what I'm trying to describe becomes physically perceptible, where the mountain's self-regard becomes something you can feel against your skin, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. I camp in those places. I paint in those places. I've gotten closer there than anywhere else. This is not a ghost story. I don't believe in ghosts in the conventional sense. What I believe is that the mountains are much older than the stories we tell about them, and that the age is not passive, it's present, ongoing, engaged with what happens in and on it in a way that exceeds what we typically expect from landscape. I'm still trying to paint it. I think that's the right response to it. Keep trying. Story 43. My son was 4 years old when he started talking to the creek. We live on a property in the North Carolina mountains Mountains with a small creek that runs along the back edge of our land. Nothing unusual about the creek. It's a normal cold water mountain stream. Native trout. Runs clear most of the year. We let our son play by it from the time he was old enough with appropriate supervision. When he was 4, he would go down to the creek and have conversations. Full conversations, speaking, pausing, responding, the complete back and forth rhythm of a dialogue. We figured it was imaginative play. 4-year-olds are creative in this way. What made us pay more attention was the specificity. He would come in from the creek and tell us things. What the weather was going to do, that an animal had died upstream. Once that someone was going to visit us, who we hadn't spoken to in a long time. His great-uncle called that evening, which he hadn't done in more than a year. We asked him once who he was talking to at the creek. He said the water. We asked what the water said. He thought about it carefully, the way young children think when they're trying to translate something. He said the water knows what came through it. He's 9 now. He stopped having the conversations around 6. He doesn't remember them in any detail, which I think is normal. Most of us don't remember the things we knew at 4. But he still gravitates to the creek, and he'll sit there quietly for a long time in a way that his siblings don't. Some knowledge, it seems, doesn't fully leave. My grandmother, when I told her about this when he was 4, said that mountain water will talk to children before they learn not to listen. She said it like it was as ordinary as anything. Story 44. I'm a retired highway patrol officer. 28 years in the force, mostly in the western mountain counties of North Carolina. I've seen a lot of things in that career that are strange, and I have a high threshold for what registers as noteworthy. This registers. There's a section of a mountain highway in my old patrol area that I drove literally thousands of times over my career. I know every foot of it. One section, about half a mile, of switchbacks on a north-facing slope was consistently the source of radio interference. Every unit that worked that road knew about it. Your radio would cut to static on that section and come back when you cleared it. We logged it, the maintenance guys looked at it. Nobody ever found an explanation. Topography, they said. Sometimes topography does that. What I never put in any official communication was this. On 6 occasions over my career, on that half mile of switchbacks, I saw something in the road that wasn't there when I reached the spot where I'd seen it. Not the same thing each time, once a figure. Twice what I'd describe as shapes that didn't correspond to objects I could name. 3 times a brightness low to the pavement that vanished well before my lights should have overtaken it. Every one of these 6 occasions happened between 2 and 4 in the morning. Every one of them happened when I was fully alert and not fatigued. I was particular about managing my sleep schedule for night shifts. I talked to 2 other officers over the years who worked that road regularly. Both of them had seen things in that section. Neither of them had reported it. When I asked one of them why not, she said because it would be my word against my career. I'm retired now. It was my word against my career, and now it isn't. Story 45. I'll close with this because it's the one I've thought about longest. I was 24 and driving alone across the Appalachians for the first time, moving from Virginia to Tennessee for a job that didn't ultimately work out. But that was the right move to make at the time. Middle of October. Late afternoon turning to evening as I was going over the highest section of the route. I pulled over at a scenic overlook because the light was doing something I'd never seen and have not seen since. The clouds were below the ridge I was on. I was above the clouds looking out across a sea of white and gray with the ridges coming through like islands. And the sun was at exactly the angle that made the entire thing gold. There was one other car at the overlook, an older woman standing at the guardrail, looking out at the same thing I was looking at. I stood there for a while, and she said without turning that it was something, wasn't it? I said it really was. She said she'd grown up in these mountains and had seen this view many times, and it was always something. I asked if she still lived here. She said she did, and she didn't, which I took as a philosophical answer about belonging to a place even when you've moved on. Then she said, still looking at the clouds, that the mountains remember everyone who's ever stood here and looked at them. I said that was a beautiful thought. She said she wasn't sure it was a thought exactly, more of an observation. She said the mountains weren't just scenic, they were attentive. She said whatever you were looking for when you looked out from a high place, the mountains were looking back. Her car was gone when I came back from the guardrail. I didn't see her leave. The light was starting to go and I had miles to drive. I've been back to that overlook twice in the years since. It's the same overlook and the same view. It's not always something. That afternoon it was something, and whatever she said about the mountains looking back, I believe it. I believed it standing there, and I believe it more now that I've had some years to understand what she might have meant. That's all of them. Genuinely thank you to every single person who wrote in this channel as your stories, and I'm just the one reading them. Submission link is always in the description if you've got something to share. Subscribe if you haven't. More videos coming, and I'll see you in the next one.